Hey, 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 everybody. Let me start this. How's it going? I hope everybody's having a really good week. Different setup this week. I'm standing. Does anybody have any questions or feedback? Did anybody start talking to their communities about systems change in the last week? Yes. Oh, can you tell us more, please, Michelle? So Michelle says, hello, how are you? Yes. Okay, I'm waiting for her to type in, and we'll see what she has to say. So today we're going to go over meeting number 6. I can't believe it's already meeting number 6. And also, as a special surprise, I've asked Catherine, who is a Vista in Denton, to talk today about everything we've covered so far, so the overarching systems change that needs to happen in communities in order to effectively end homelessness, but also she's going to address what we're going to talk about both today and what we talked about last week in terms of the need for internal systems change. So she's going to join us today, and she's actually going to join us again next week. So I'm really excited to hear her insight because she's been working a lot on this in the last almost a year now, which is incredible. And also really sad because her term's almost up and she's great. And I'm not just saying that because you're on, Catherine. Okay, anyway. Okay, let's see. Oh, Michelle just typed in. So we're getting our facilitator and talking to HMIS personnel so we can set up training. I've just been talking to my staff to get them on board at this time. So I knew about the facilitator, which is really great news. They were able to get the vice president and director of community impact, I believe that's the title, for her name's Wendy, to at the local United Way. I believe it's the United Way of South Cameron County, to serve as the facilitator and leader of this process. So that's really incredible news. She's volunteered to take this on, which is amazing. And so I'm really excited to see what Cameron County is going to accomplish also in the next several months. So that's awesome, Michelle. I'm really glad to hear that. Okay, so back to meeting number 6. So today we're covering meeting number 6. I put the link in the chat in case anybody wanted to follow along. Sorry. Let me turn my phone off. In case anybody wants to follow along. So like we said last week, so meeting number 5 was the start of doing more of that internal look at processes and procedures to see how that impacts the system. You may have heard this before, but I know Ian DeYoung says it a lot, and other people in the realm of housing and homelessness are starting to say that your system's only as good as your lowest performing project. Effectively saying that your lowest performing project is going to drag your entire system down, and that, I would say, that's true. We've seen that across the state. And so meeting number 6 is just a continuation of this conversation about internal processes change. So last week, it was looking more at the best practices and providing the different intervention types like rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, permanent supportive housing, diversion. And this week, it's taking that and asking them to do a really critical analysis of their internal process. So just like the rest of the meetings, it'll start with some social time, welcome and introductions, and then an overview of the last meeting where you'll say, we looked at all the research, we talked about it, did anybody have, like in the last week, has anybody thought anything else? You could do a mini debrief again since people have had time to think about it some more, hopefully, and especially in the context of the work that they do day in and day out. And then you're going to do 2 activities. So the first one is called the Eligibility Requirements Analysis. So what that requires is people are going to, if they don't know their eligibility requirements off the top of their head, you're going to have to tell them that they need to bring their policies and procedures, which should contain their eligibility requirements. And so what they're going to do is they're going to use their eligibility requirements to, let's see, there's this worksheet. So basically what we want to find out is for every eligibility requirement, why is it an eligibility requirement? What we're seeing across the country when it comes to efforts to end homelessness is that those entities that reduce their eligibility requirements to just those that are funder mandated are effectively lowering their barriers to entry into their projects. And so that's kind of what we're trying to get at. We're trying to figure out why things are in place. I was telling Catherine this story yesterday. I read a lot about systems change and change management. And there was a really good case study, which Dakota, you may appreciate this, that I read last week about a hospital in Britain that had a book, and bicyclists or people that commuted via bike would come and sign the book every day. And they had a consultant come in looking at processes, and the consultant asked, why do you guys have this book? And nobody could answer it. And so they did some investigation and found that the book is actually a holdover from World War II, where they were asking people to ration gasoline, right, and oil, because they wanted to divert that to the wartime effort. And so if you biked to work, you would get additional food rationing. So it's this process that was ingrained into the DNA of this entity that really served no function in the modern day. And so that's what we're trying to do with this process. It's not kind of what we're trying to do, it is what we are trying to do. So we're trying to identify those eligibility requirements that are holdovers that may not make any sense anymore because maybe you don't have that funding type anymore, or whatever the reasoning may be. So this is an opportunity for people to really critically think about, why do we have the eligibility requirements that we have? I have some examples here of good and bad eligibility requirements, and it's broken down by emergency shelters and then housing projects. We encourage you to look at these with providers and identify which ones they think are good and which ones they think are bad. I don't necessarily like assigning moral stuff to it, but for lack of a better word. And then the other one is the housing intervention. And just so you guys know, our threshold for your PMPs and for your eligibility requirements here is, would I want to stay here? If I were homeless, would I want to live here? So I encourage you guys, and while you're facilitating this process, to think about this in that vein with participants. So that's the first thing that you're going to do. There are instructions here, right? So you're going to pass out the handouts, people will go through everything, and then essentially you'll do a debrief, right? Like, why are those the eligibility requirements that you have? Are there ways that you can not do that? All that kind of stuff. And that's an example of one of those really heavy conversations. Okay, sorry, I'm reading something. Okay, so John, I'm going to address this at the end. I think that's an excellent question, so I'll read your question later and answer it, because I'm sure other people will have the same questions. So that's the first thing that you're going to do, is you're going to go through. So Irma asks, is there one that is really good that maybe we can adopt? So Irma, there is more stuff coming out, and ultimately it depends on your intervention type, to be honest. What I'll try to do is try to populate this folder with examples of ideal eligibility requirements, right? And honestly, it's kind of hard because it is really dependent on what is funder mandated, right? So it'll vary from situation to situation, and that's why it's important to do this analysis. But that's a good question. So the next thing that you're going to do is called internal system mapping. So this is one of the things that I really love. I'm a systems improvement nerd, obviously. And one thing that I really enjoy doing with communities is mapping their process from start to finish. So somebody comes in, identifies as homeless. How do they work? How do they go through the project or through the agency to end up housed? And what are all those steps? And how long does it take? And so there's another handout for the internal system map activity directions. I actually did something, I did an example on our whiteboard so you can see what we're looking for. So you're going to go through each step, step A, step B, step C, identifying what are those things that people need to do in order to get housed through a specific project. So the example that I have here is that household presents for assistance and that we're checking for eligibility. And so if they're eligible, what happens? And if they're not eligible, what happens? And we're also asking providers to put an estimate of how long each process takes. So like the in-between between two steps, how long does that take if appropriate? So for example, when I worked at Catholic Charities of the East Bay in Oakland, people would come in, we would check to see if they were baseline eligible for the program. If they weren't, we would hand them a stack of, I would hand them a stack of documents and say, maybe you should try these people. And then, and then if they were eligible, we would make an appointment with the case manager, but that would usually take 2 to 3 weeks. And they would have to go through additional screening at that point. And then the case manager would have to meet with the supervisor and the other case management staff at like case conferencing, and that usually took another week, depending on when that client came in. And then if they were approved based off of the case conferencing, when I was working there, it took 2 to 3 weeks to get a check written, which is obscene, and I know they've changed it since then. But do you see how the days keep adding up, and it's taking longer and longer to get people from the crisis to a house situation, so basically from crisis to stability? And so that's what we're really trying to look at, is what is the process? And we're trying to also do an analysis, right, of that. So what are the things that you can basically not do anymore? And I think one thing that you guys are really going to see in this, especially those of you that understand coordinated entry and have been talking about it, is that some of this process is eliminated with coordinated entry, because when you're going through coordinated entry, your assessor's already checking to see if people are eligible and they're making those appropriate referrals. So basically this process right here is, or sorry, you guys can't see me like putting my hand up here, but basically this, like everything prior to this process, so from refer to other agencies and schedule intake for 4 weeks later to household presents for assistance, really doesn't happen anymore, because your coordinated entry is taking care of that. And that's when you hear me talk about the benefits of coordinated entry, I talk a lot about the chaos of the system, right? The chaos for people experiencing a crisis and the chaos that you guys experience every day, right? It's chaotic. It's exhausting. Everybody's in a crisis. And coordinated entry creates some organization both for participants but also for frontline staff. It cuts down on the amount of calls potentially and most likely that you're going to be getting. It will probably most likely cut down on the flow of people coming into your agency if you're not an entry point. So we're really encouraging providers to look at what they do both in terms of their eligibility requirements and their processes that may inadvertently cause people to be homeless longer. Does that make sense? It's a very heavy conversation, because I wouldn't want to admit that my processes or my eligibility requirements in some way facilitate long-time homeless in our community, but the fact of the matter is, to some extent it does. So can you eliminate an extra meeting with people? Can you try to meet people where they're at? That kind of stuff. Does anybody have any questions about this? And this ties in very strongly with the idea of lowering your barriers, right? We want to make the system as accessible as possible to the people who right now we know aren't accessing the system because it's crowding them out. Okay, any questions? John, I'm going to answer yours in a second. I want to see if there's anything else about this. Okay, so Irma, can I get a print from those PowerPoints? So Irma, are you talking about what I'm showing right now? So this, if you go to the chat functionality, I think I sent you the link last week. It's the same thing. This is where you access the information. So where I write in the chat box, here is a link to the toolkit. Yeah, and it's also the link that I sent you last week, I think. Okay. So John asks, and this is a really great question. So Sophia, as we go through this, a lot of it seems like it's really geared for service providers. We're planning to invite business owners and community leaders, etc., to the meeting. How do we make the case that this is important for them, is respectful of their time, and isn't irrelevant over their heads? Are these systems change meetings primarily for service providers or a larger group of community decision makers? I think that you should have everybody involved in this discussion, even if the analysis is looking heavily at service providers. And I'm going to ask actually Catherine to talk to this a little bit. It's important for everybody to be educated about this stuff, even your business leaders, even your community leaders. And I think this is an excellent opportunity for that to happen. So I think that you can be thoughtful in your inclusion of them, and you can also utilize this third party basically, right? Because they're not in the weeds or in the thick of it every day. You can basically utilize this third party to cast a fresh eye at all of this stuff, right? Because there are people that are not involved in the nitty-gritty of the housing crisis response system every day. So they may have really great insight or ideas or critiques that you guys may never have thought of. So I think the important thing with this, John, is when you start this process, acknowledging the fact that a lot of it, most of it is geared towards service providers. And the reason why it's geared towards service providers is they're the ones that provide that direct care to people experiencing homelessness. But ultimately, you need these other people in the room to, one, hold providers accountable. And also, these people are going to see the benefit of ending homelessness, right? So that's my take on that. I'm going to have, does that make sense? And I'm going to ask, actually, Catherine, I'm going to unmute you or have you unmute yourself in a second, but if you could talk about that in the context of like the Denton County Homeless Leadership Team and what you've seen in the education of your different politicians and community leaders in terms of ending homelessness. So I'm going to unmute Catherine in a second, actually. So again, Catherine Gonzalez, she's a VISTA in Denton. She is with the United Way of Denton County. And for anybody else who might be interested in getting a VISTA to facilitate this process, I believe the cost is about $4,100, and you would basically do that process through us. So we would help with all the hiring and everything, and they would be stationed in your community. And I think getting a VISTA has been an amazing investment for Denton because Catherine is leading the coordinated entry system there. So I'm going to unmute you, Catherine. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, actually.
Okay, is it working now? Okay, good. So to speak on what Sophia just mentioned about the Denton County Homeless Leadership Team, basically it's a team that is comprised of community stakeholders, like the mayor is involved. We have the community development coordinator in there from the city of Denton. We also have local law enforcement, which is really exciting. And it's also comprised of local case managers and service providers. So basically what I have done is sometimes if they have any questions, I've had to create documents about coordinated entry, how the process works, and also on the broader spectrum of a homeless crisis response system and how it functions. So from this point, we've been talking about a homeless crisis response system, and I have a really cheesy analogy. So when we talk about a homeless crisis response system, I think of it as like a body, like a human body, And so now we're talking about internal change. So that would be like your body's made of like a skeletal system, a respiratory system, muscular system. So in order for your body to function and thrive, all of those systems need to be working, right? So for you to thrive and live. So in a homeless crisis response system, which is made of street outreach, supportive housing, permanent supportive housing, emergency shelter, all of those systems need to be working in order to get people housed or to prevent homelessness and resolve homelessness. So what I have done when I started my VISTA internship or volunteership, one of the first things I did, like Sophia mentioned earlier, was create a system map with each service provider that was working on coordinated entry. So what I did is I went to each agency and sat with them and told them to treat me like I was a client. How would I, as a client that is presenting as homeless, would have to do in order to receive housing? So after mapping out each process, I went back and looked at how does their process compare to best and emerging practices that are put out by our HUD or the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and went back and made recommendations. And what like a huge step for us right now is with Salvation Army, which I've been working with for the past 8 to 10 months. I think it's 10 months now. They've agreed to do coordinated entry in real time with clients, which is really exciting and is a huge step for them in their internal processes, because now they get to, and they've seen it themselves, how easy, after I sat down and like showed them the process, I think it sounded a lot more harder to them when I was explaining it and talking to them or writing documents of how the coordinated entry system works. I actually took time and sat down with them and showed them from start to finish how to put a client into coordinated entry and making referrals. And it was just so funny because they were like, that's it, that's all, like that's like way more convenient than what we've been doing using HMIS and using paper intake. So they've decided to completely end their paper intakes and do everything in the HMIS system, which is really exciting. So that's just an example of how looking at your internal processes and seeing what is working, what's not working, and what can be repurposed in order to successfully get clients housed. So anything else you would like me to talk about?
Awesome, Catherine. Would you say that it's mostly a situation of being resourceful with what you have rather than necessarily constantly looking for resources?
Yes, I would say so. So one of the things that I did was, another thing I did, and I'm still kind of working on it and putting the finishing touches on it, is like a needs assessment of some sort. So what I did is I went to each agency and also to community stakeholders and asked what is available in our community. So in our community, we have an emergency shelter, we have 2, and we have some rapid rehousing funds, we have some permanent supportive housing programs, but the permanent supportive housing programs are for people experiencing, people living with HIV or AIDS, and some people that are living with mental illnesses or physical disabilities. So right now in our community, there's no permanent supportive housing for people just experiencing homelessness that are not living with HIV or AIDS or a mental or physical disability. So I would say for our community would be looking at more rapid rehousing, how to get more rapid rehousing funds, and 2, how we can network and outreach to private landlords in order to get people housed. And I think that would be a solution for our community in working with what we have now, instead of saying, instead of trying to make it a little bit more harder on ourselves and trying to find out how we can build more houses or build more affordable housing units for people.
Awesome. Catherine, John asked, can you come to Abilene next? We've put in for a visit to help us implement CE.
Sure.
She doesn't really mean that. She lives in.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah.
Does any, he said seriously, but does anybody have any questions for Catherine? She's going to be on again next week to talk a little bit more about how I've been working with Denton for 4 years, but I would say it's been in the last year or so that they've really picked it up in terms of the effort to end homelessness. And so she's going to be talking next time a little bit about what led them to do that and the successes that they've been having through that. It goes beyond just getting the Salvation Army to do assessments directly into HMIS, which is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Catherine, thank you so much. I will FaceTime you after.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So that's it for meeting number 6. Does anybody have any questions about this at all? So again, from what I've seen in the last 4 years and what we're seeing across the country, that if agencies aren't willing to look at their processes and procedures and willing to invest in some change, it's going to be really hard to change your overall system. And so this is going to be an issue that's very difficult. A lot of agencies don't do internal evaluations because you have to be vulnerable in order to do that. And this is fortunately, unfortunately, forcing them to do that. So it's going to be an interesting meeting. It could potentially be a little bit heavy, but what we're ultimately trying to move people towards is how can we streamline our processes as a system, but how can you streamline your process as an agency, and how can we make our system more inclusive of everybody experiencing homelessness, not necessarily the people who would probably be most likely to end their homeless experience on their own. So with that being said, if you have any questions, y'all know where to reach me. I'm always available, more than happy to answer any questions, review any materials that you create, what have you. I'll see you guys again next week for meeting number 7. We're almost done, 2 more webinars. And I want to thank all of you for sticking with us. I know it requires time out of your week, every week for 8 weeks. But I think it's worth it, and I'm glad that you guys are taking the time to read the toolkit and come to the webinars. It means a lot. Okay, I hope everybody has a great rest of their week. Again, if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Bye, everybody.